Well, I want to thank you all for coming out to the Challen Auditorium at University of Alabama in Huntsville tonight. Also like to thank the people that are viewing this on the web. If you are a big social media person and you would like to make other people aware of this, I understand there's a live stream of this, and you can go to tacticalfaith.com/live-stream. People in the audience here, if you could take a moment and either turn off your phones or silent them, that would be appreciated. And please, no flash photography. This event is hosted by Ratio Christi and the UAH Non-Theists. Ratio Christi is a student organization at UAH that explores the evidences for Christianity and helps students know why they believe what they believe. They're one of about 100 chapters across the country, and you can find more information about them online, on Facebook, and at ratiochristi.org/UAH. Ratio Christi wanted to thank UAH and the Student Government Association for helping them to co-host this event. They would like to give a special thanks to Juanita Owen for extra efforts in helping behind the scenes, and Matt Burford of Tactical Faith to introducing them to Dr. Marshall. You can find more about Tactical Faith at tacticalfaith.com. Finally, Ratio Christi would like to thank the UAH Non-Theists for co-hosting this event with them, and they are looking forward to the great discussions this debate will inspire. For their part, the UAH Non-Theists are a student organization at UAH that focuses on the networking of non-theists, as well as the public education about atheism and secularism. More information about the UAH Non-Theists can be found online at uahnontheists.com. They are an affiliate of the Secular Student Alliance, and more information on the Secular Student Alliance can be found at secularstudents.org. The UAH Non-Theists would like to thank Charles Miller for his assistance in making this event possible. Mr. Miller is the executive director of the Secular Coalition for Alabama. More information about them can be found at secularal.org. And finally, the UAH Non-Theists would like to thank the Secular Student Alliance and the UA Huntsville Student Government Association for their sponsorship of this event. As for myself, I'm Nicholas Jones. I'm a professor in the philosophy department at UAH in the College of Liberal Arts, and I'm very happy to be involved in moderating this debate. I invite the audience to check out the College of Liberal Arts website for courses that, if you're interested in religion or things like that, and also for other public events that we sponsor throughout the school year. As for the speakers, on my near side, we have David Marshall. He speaks frequently on the new atheism, the history of Asian Christianity, and how Christianity relates to other religions. Dr. Marshall served for 13 years as a missionary and lecturer at various schools in East Asia, including at Siebold and Nagasaki universities. He has a doctorate in theology of world religions from Oxford Center for Mission Studies, and an MA from the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. Dr. Marshall is the sole author of 5 books, including Jesus and the Religion of Man, Why the Jesus Seminar Can't Find Jesus, and Grandma Marshall Cloud, and The Truth Behind the New Atheism. His newest book, which he just published in September, is called Faith Seeking Understanding, featuring contributions from, among others, the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, the quantum physicist Don Page, Oxford historian of science Alan Chapman, sociologist Rodney Stark, Chinese reformer Wan Ziming, and anthropologist Miriam Adney. Dr. Marshall's also written for Christianity Today, First Things, Books and Culture, Touchstone, and contributed 2 chapters to the anthology True Reason. His dissertation, formulating a, quote, fulfillment model, end quote, of religions in the context of Chinese tradition is due to be published in 2013. Our other speaker today, far from me, is Richard Carrier. He is a world-renowned author and speaker. As a professional historian, published philosopher, and prominent defender of the American free thought movement, Dr. Carrier has appeared across the country and on national television defending sound historical methods and the ethical worldview of secular naturalism. His books and articles have also received international attention. He holds a PhD from Columbia University in ancient history, specializing in the intellectual history of Greece and Rome, particularly ancient philosophy, religion, and science, with an emphasis on the origins of Christianity and the use and progress of science under the Roman Empire. He's best known as author of Sense and Goodness Without God, Not the Impossible Faith, and Why I Am Not a Christian. And he is a major contributor to The Empty Tomb, The Christian Delusion, The End of Christianity, and Sources of the Jesus Tradition, as well as writer and editor-in-chief, now emeritus, for the Secular Web, and for his copious work in history and philosophy, online and in print. His latest book is Proving History, Bayes' Theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. He's currently working on his next books, on the historicity of Jesus Christ, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, and Science Education in the Early Roman Empire. So much by way of introductions. The format for our debate, we will have Dr. Marshall speak for 20 minutes with an opening affirmative statement, followed by Dr. Carrier speak for 20 minutes with an opening negative statement. Then each of our speakers will have 10 minutes each for rebuttal and 5 minutes each for closing. We then plan to take a 5-minute break for restroom purposes, and then we will reconvene for a 30-minute question and answer session, at which time the audience is invited to approach the two mics in the aisles, and I will plan to just alternate back and forth. So without further ado, thank you for coming, and Dr. Marshall.
Thank you, and thank you so much for coming. I can't actually see you, but I believe by faith that you're out there. I also would like to thank Richard for coming. Richard is someone who thinks outside the box, and he's willing to take on big issues, and I really like that. I don't agree with the conclusions that he comes to, but that's what we're here to talk about tonight. The debate is entitled, Is the Christian Faith Reasonable? What does that mean? Some of you may be afraid that having the word faith and reason together in the same sentence may cause the building to explode. It won't happen, don't worry. Faith and reason have been intimately associated in Christian thought for 2,000 years. Time is limited, so I better stick to the basics. I think there's something to be said for the classical philosophical arguments from the nature, origin, or fine-tuning of the universe, or from the very concept of who God must be as developed by modern theistic philosophers. I don't think those arguments are conclusive, but I think they're suggestions. Anyway, I'm not going to use them tonight. If you want to see a really good debate on that subject, at least from the Christian perspective, William Lane Craig's debate with Alex Rosenberg last week was really interesting. But there's going to be practically no overlap with the debate tonight. I am a student of world religions and history, and those are the perspectives from which I'll be arguing. I made two arguments this morning: that Christianity makes sense of world religions, and that it has reformed and makes better sense of how we understand history. But there's no time for those arguments either tonight. I want to argue from facts that are available to people in this audience with a little study or asking around. This question, is the Christian faith reasonable, can mean at least three things. First, is Christianity reasonable in the pragmatic sense? Does it deliver the goods? Is it useful for individual or for society, for humanity, this thing called Christianity? I had a friend in Hong Kong who was an engineer, and he told me that at engineering school there tends to be a lot of good Christian fellowships because engineers like things that work. Well, I agree. Christian faith works for individuals and for society, but that was not what I'm going to be focusing on tonight. This question could also mean, do Christians employ reasoning in arguing for Christianity? Or is the Christian faith supposed to be something one believes not only without evidence, but in the teeth of the evidence, as Richard Dawkins famously claims? Well, I think the Christian faith is something that's closely associated with reason, but I want to make a stronger claim tonight. Not only is the Christianity reasonable in that it makes practical sense to believe it, and that Christians have always reasoned to and for their faith, there are also good reasons to believe that Christianity is true, good evidences. Let me give three briefly. Number one, miracles. Number two, anthropology, a God who transcends particular cultures. Number three, New Testament criticism, Jesus, the person of Jesus. First of all, miracles. Richard has said that he could imagine sufficient technical and professional documentation of some kinds of supernatural events like levitation that would convince him, or so could directly witnessing it myself. So Richard concedes, first of all, that whether or not believing something is reasonable is a personal thing. Something might be reasonable for me having a certain amount of evidence, or for you, and maybe not for me because you have a certain amount of background knowledge, and I don't. He also concedes that the direct experience of miracles, barring drug use or something like that, may render belief in something apparently beyond nature reasonable for the person who experiences it. How might this work? Let's give an example. 20 or some years ago, I was working as a faith missionary in the country of Taiwan. And faith missionary basically meant I didn't have any money. And I prayed for it. I didn't ask anybody. One Friday, I was out of money. I went to the bank and I had a check from the U.S. And they said, sorry, we can't cash it right now. So I went back home to take inventory. And lo and behold, I had no toilet paper, no soap, and no food, and no money to buy any of it with, but a little more than $1. So I took that little more than $1, and I bought, on Saturday morning, I bought a ticket to Taipei Station, and I started wandering around New Park near Taipei train station, complaining to God, God, what am I doing in Taiwan? I don't even have enough money to buy a hamburger with. And I'm going to go home. I'm tired of this. See what a faith missionary is, has lots of faith. And after complaining like this for a while, I got tired of talking to somebody who didn't answer me, so I started going out of the park, and there was a girl, kind of pretty. She was reading a newspaper. I struck up a conversation with her. She was reading an English newspaper. And after we talked for a while, she asked me, what's your name? I got up to leave. She said, what's your name? I said, I'm Ma Dewey. She said, Nijir Ma Dewey, Ma? Are you really Ma Dewey? I said, yeah. It turned out that a few years before, I had found a wallet, a billfold, on the campus of National Taiwan University, several miles away, and I'd taken it to Lost and Found, and I'd written a little note in it that said, God loves you, Ma Dewey. And this was that girl. In a city of 4.5 million people, several years later, just when I was praying for that. Now, there's a longer story than that. Several other things happened, and all of my needs happened to be met that time when I was praying in some amount of need. Now, what does this mean? It's an anecdote. It's a coincidence. Maybe, you meet lots of people. Maybe this is just blind luck. Maybe it's a 2 on a scale of 1 to 10. Maybe it's a little bit of evidence that something was really happening beyond coincidence. But I happen to know it was true because I happened to be there. Richard says that God's absolute silence and complete inactivity in our own experience. He says, no one has observed a real act of God or any real evidence of his inhabiting or observing the universe. I can't really say that that's true for me. And what do I do then with the story of Jesus' disciples and his huge catch of fish? Maybe that's a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. What about the stories I heard from other missionaries I met about much longer series of coincidences in response to desperate needs and prayer? Some cases maybe a 4 or a 5. People I know they're not lying. Maybe they tell me the story over popcorn at 12 o'clock at night. Smart, honest people, in some cases critical thinkers, even scientists. I get to know a PhD student in law at one of the world's major universities. He's from an African country. He used to be an imam in a mosque. And he tells me he was sitting in his mosque minding his own business one day, and he says he heard the audible voice of God. Said, follow Jesus. So, as an imam, he knew that as a specialist in Islamic law, he knew that if you convert to Christianity or some other religion, you're worthy of death. He knew it'd risk his life, but he left his country. He's never been back because he is so convinced that he had actually heard from God. Is it reasonable for him to believe in supernatural? I think so. How about a young man I meet in southern China who tells me they can laugh at me, my friends can laugh at me, but I will never stop believing in God because his wife had been cured from a head injury. Or a man who was dying of throat cancer. The doctor said he had no hope. A man I met on the coast of China. He went home and some people prayed for him, and he saw a vision of Jesus who said, go preach the gospel, and he was cured. And he'd been preaching the gospel ever since. It turns out that a high percentage of converts to Christianity in places like India, China, and other parts of the world convert through either such experiences personally or experiences that others relate. Craig Keener, a New Testament scholar, has documented many of these stories in a book that's about 1,100 pages long, telling hundreds of stories of how God has helped different people around the world in ministry, including some of these stories are maybe 8, 9, 10 on the scale of 1 to 10, including things that happened to him personally and to his wife. So miracles don't just happen to superstitious old ladies, they happen to geniuses who changed the world, like St. Augustine records some of these events in his own life, and St. Patrick, Matteo Ricci, and the Chinese Jesuits, and many others. So what? Richard says, suppose you have had that experience, suppose you've not had that experience. Richard says that in truth, science is actually a subordinate to history, and I agree with him on that point. In some ways, science is the record of things that have been recorded in the past, patterns that have been observed, and understanding of the universe based on what experiments that have been done in the past and related to us by other people. Richard also admitted in a debate with Michael Lacana that if he himself had close friends whom he trusted intimately, who told him about things that happened in their lives that were beyond the understanding beyond the possibility of explaining naturally, that he would believe it supernaturally. So, this seems to concede that not only for the tens of millions of people who have directly had supernatural experiences, but also for the hundreds of millions of people who have heard about such reports from people that have good reason to trust, it is reasonable to believe in a supernatural. Second point, God. There's a very popular argument among new atheists that God is the construct of a particular culture, and therefore he is nothing more than an artifact. Richard Dawkins says, not surprisingly, since it is founded on local traditions of private revelation rather than evidence, the God hypothesis comes in many versions. Historians of religion recognize a progression from primitive tribal animisms through polytheisms to monotheisms. Emil Durkheim, the founder of sociology in some ways, said that religious beliefs have varied infinitely. This shows that none of them expresses truth adequately. And Richard Carrier also says, were the Christian God genuinely communicating with us, his communications would be consistent across all times and regions. So here's the argument, made in many ways. Dan Dennett is another person who makes this argument. Here's the argument. If God existed, he would transcend the creation of any given culture. But God does not transcend the creation of any given culture. He arose during maybe the reign of King Josiah in the Old Testament, and then radiated out to form Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But as Durkheim also noted, the Australian God was fundamentally the same everywhere. Eternal, a sort of creator, father of men, made animals and trees, benefactor, communicates, punishes, judges after death, and they feel his presence everywhere. In my study on Chinese religions, the word for God in ancient China is Shangdi, from the Shang dynasty, and then Tian in the Zhou dynasty. I won't give you all the characteristics of God for want of time, but he also conforms to the same pattern. So, Richard Carrier also admits this a little bit in The Christian Delusion. Most intellectual polytheists believed in a creator who had intellectually ordered the cosmos. The Greeks became dissatisfied with the gods of Mount Olympus, and they began to realize that there was one supreme God who was above all others. So forget about the argument you just disbelieve in one more God than we do. The Christian God is not just one more God. That's a bad pun. God is conceptually as distinct from the gods as Tinkerbell's pixie dust is conceptually distinct from the Big Bang. God is, in Anselm's word, he than whom greater one cannot conceive. Furthermore, the atheist argument is God does not transcend one culture, so there is no God. He is the product of his culture. Let's reverse that. It turns out that God does transcend Hebrew and American culture. He clearly is not the product of one society or even one kind of society. Does it not follow, using Dawkins, Durkheim's, and even Richard's argument, that if God does transcend any one culture, he is not the product of human imagination? Third, Jesus. A couple years ago, my wife was walking through the busiest train station in the world, Shinjuku Station in Tokyo. A couple million people go through there every day. As she was walking, that's every day, as she was walking down this flood of humanity like a river, up the other way, another flood of humanity, tens of thousands of people, somebody noticed her and picked her out in the crowd. They stopped, they looked at each other. Ha! Hiroko from Seattle, her good friend. Both not too tall, not too short, average-heighted, pretty Japanese women, black hair, the same as everybody else in the crowd. What was it about Mayumi, my wife, that allowed Hiroko to notice her in this flooding crowd of tens of thousands of people? Just some slight difference in the nose or the eyes or something like that, and she noticed her. Where's Waldo kind of a moment. Let's set that story to the side for a moment. We'll come back to it. I disagree with Richard Carrier in that I think that conventional historical research on Jesus has yielded a great deal of fruit, established a great deal. Even from people like Thomas Jefferson, the skeptic, who said the eloquence and persuasiveness of the Gospels is far beyond the feeble minds, he said, of the Gospel writers to invent. William Paley, who found the manner, the similitude of manner, which indicates that the actions and discourses proceed from the same person. In other words, you can triangulate from the Gospels, the different Gospels, to a historical person. Robert Funk, the founder of the Jesus Seminar, wrote about parables on which he was an expert. He said they're virtually unknown in the Old Testament and rarely successfully imitated in Christian lore. Very few sages have achieved the same level of creativity as the Jesus of the Gospels. John Crossan realized that Jesus was a prophet of the margins who overturned social convention. Richard Burridge has shown that the Gospels conform to the category of bioi, or Greek biography. Morton Smith, a professor at Columbia University where Richard studied, shows that miracles infuse every single layer of the Gospels, and they cannot be taken. Jesus was a worker of miracles. The historical Jesus must have worked miracles, he argues. Now, we can set these characteristics against each other and do kind of a zero-sum game thing where only one can be right. They have to fight and struggle against one another. But Marcus Borg, more perceptively, realized that Jesus could be all of these things at once, like an elephant. Blind men feeling the elephant. They feel one part of Jesus. And Marcus Borg recognized he was a spirit person. He was a charismatic healer or holy person. He was a subversive sage who undermined conventional wisdom and taught an alternative wisdom. He was a social prophet, an initiator of a movement, the purpose of which was the revitalization of Israel. That's a pretty big elephant. Richard Bauckham has recently written a brilliant book showing that the Gospels almost certainly contain a great deal of eyewitness testimony. N.T. Wright, the great British scholar, says that has shown, as the philosopher Raymond Martin says, the Gospels make remarkably good historical sense. One of the tools that he uses to show that is something called double similarity, double dissimilarity, which I think is a very powerful tool. But, okay, this is a sampling of some of the historical research on Jesus and certain perspectives on who Jesus is, which added together make a remarkable person that I think gives a very good reason to believe. But in my contention is that ordinary readers can meet Jesus by simply reading the Gospels for themselves. Our eyes are created or evolved to recognize human faces, and no one, having read the Gospels, can unrecognize Jesus without cost to his or her honesty. I have described 50 characteristics that the Gospels share in common, all four Gospels share in common, having to do with the setting, the style, the literary character, having to do with moral. Jesus is a moralist. Jesus in society, how he treats other people. Jesus is a teacher, and theological characteristics. Many of them would have nothing to do with something one would make up just in order to make up a good story. These are things, however, that we pick up without noticing. At least 26 of these characteristics relate to historicity, and all 26 of those characteristics strongly favor the essential historicity of the main narratives of the Gospels. But I maintain that we pick up on many of these qualities even without noticing. These three sets of facts, first of all, the fact that miracles do, in fact, seem to happen. Secondly, that God is not limited to one culture, but that he transcends culture. And thirdly, the person of Jesus, I maintain, are all good reasons to believe in Christianity. And Richard Carrier seems to implicitly admit the premises of parts of the first two arguments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. We next have Dr. Carrier, who will speak for 20 minutes.
All right. I can't give you all the reasons I think Christianity is unreasonable in the time given here, so I'm only going to focus on a few. But of course, obviously, at the end of this debate, you should go out and explore and learn more of my writings, more of David's writings, others, Christians, atheists, and so on, and learn about this beyond what gets covered in this debate. So I'm going to just get to my main choice of what I'm going to argue as the negative case for what we're talking about here, the reasonableness of the Christian faith. And I want you to think about a fact that I read about on the plane here. I was reading an article about a particular charity group that's working on a particular problem these days. And it was a quite alarming statistic that this charity was working with. And that's the fact that every 21 seconds, somewhere on Earth, a child dies from contaminated water. That means by the end of my opening statement, over 50 children will have died of diseases contracted from their local water supply. Now start counting off the deaths in your head. It's pretty horrific. This is one of thousands of examples of fundamental injustice in the structure and design of the world that I could mention. But to keep it simple, I'll just use this one in particular because it is especially relevant to Christianity. In the time of Jesus, half of all children died before adulthood from diseases. I want you to imagine that. Imagine that now, more than half of all children born, all children you know, your own children, never survive to be adults. Most die miserably. And imagine that's just the way things are, and yet it's totally preventable. I want you to think about that for a moment while I fix my computer. Not only could someone who had the ability to eradicate all diseases just get rid of the problem altogether, right immediately, but even just knowing the germ theory of disease and how to decontaminate water, food, and milk, and sterilize instruments and utensils, and maintain community sanitation, even that can reduce the frequency of child death from half of all children to less than 1 in 1,000, like in America today. Now imagine that now that half of all the children you know are dying, but we could make that 1 in 1,000. Now, did Jesus do that for us? Did he or his God tell us about germs or parasites or how to create a less diseased world? No. Humans had to figure it out on their own after thousands of years of misery, and then they had to do it themselves. Jesus never mentioned anything about how to create this better world that we made, nor did any Christian get the message for almost 2,000 years of ruling half the world. And when they did get it, it didn't come from Jesus or God. It came from guesswork and experiment. It came from science. In the Gospels, the Jews come to Jesus and complain that his disciples don't wash their hands before they eat, like everyone else was doing. In fact, everyone else was washing their cooking utensils as well. We now know that that's a pretty good idea, and we know why. It reduced infection. So did Jesus say, hey, you're right. In fact, you should do that even more diligently because it will kill the germs that kill you and all your children? No. Jesus argued that we don't have to wash our hands before we eat, that washing is a human tradition with no endorsement from God, and that nothing we put into us can harm us. And as he is claimed to have said in the Gospel of Mark, not even poison. Clearly, Jesus knew nothing about germs, nor did he know that faith doesn't make you immune to poison either. Notably, nowhere in the New Testament does Jesus or God ever impart any correct knowledge or information about the world that wasn't already known to men of the time. Thus, apparently, Jesus and his God were as ignorant as every other first-century human. So Jesus said nothing about the existence of germs and what to do about them. He thus failed to save the lives of millions upon millions of innocent children. He and his God just let them die miserably for thousands and thousands of years, because remember, humanity's been around for a lot longer than Jesus has. Jesus also didn't say anything about parasites, waterborne or animal-borne. Most curiously, the Gospels only have Jesus perform occasional faith healings on people with no actual verifiable diseases. Similar faith healing acts are performed in all religions today, yet they never cure any verifiable disease like malaria or influenza, anecdotes aside. We've never scientifically confirmed this. Much less did they restore lost organs or limbs. Jesus also never cured any verifiable disease, nor ever restored any lost organ or limb. Jesus thus had no more power than any other random faith healer from any other religion today. Not just Christians can do faith healing, Muslims and other practitioners of other religions can. Pagans did as well. Now let's compare that with what an actual God could do. A God, or any man granted his power, could cure all sick people on the whole earth. Now imagine Jesus had done that. With just a thought, not just a few people he happened to bump into in one tiny corner of the world. In fact, an actual God, or any man granted his power, could simply eliminate all germs and parasites altogether, or render them all harmless to humans, or at least to children. But no, Jesus and his God didn't do anything godlike. Just as their knowledge was ignorantly human, so was their ability. In the time of Jesus, the top killers of millions of children and adults were malaria, typhoid, and tuberculosis. Pay close attention to the Gospels. Never once does Jesus ever meet a single person clearly afflicted with those ailments. And yet those are the most common ailments, most commonly killing people around him at the time. Once, according to the Gospels, he cured a fever, and that's it, just an ordinary fever. Yet hundreds of thousands were dying of those more serious illnesses all around him. Carefully avoiding them, Jesus never had to try to heal them. We know he couldn't, as no other human faith healer can either. Because faith healing isn't real. It's psychosomatic. If it worked, we'd have faith healing wings in all our hospitals. Malaria, killer of millions of children, even still today, shockingly, even after 2,000 years of Christianity, malaria is caused by parasites transmitted by mosquitoes, which breed in stagnant pools of water and can be warded off with chemicals and nets or just killed. At the very least, Jesus could have mentioned that. Hey, you should do something about those stagnant pools of water over here, and there's this thing called a mosquito net I want to tell you about. But no, Jesus didn't even know to do that, much less just eliminate the malaria parasite like any actual God would do. Typhoid and other lethal fevers are transmitted by a lack of public and personal sanitation, basic germ theory of disease. Jesus didn't mention that either or do anything about it. A leading cause of tuberculosis in children is contaminated milk. Ever wonder why we pasteurize our milk? Now you know. Did Jesus tell us that? No. You'd think a really nice thing to do would be to tell everyone that the milk they are drinking and the cheese they are eating is killing them and their kids, and that simply heating the milk up a bit would solve the problem, saving millions of lives and ending ages of misery. An actual God, or anyone in regular chat mode with him, would at least know to tell us how to fight these diseases: washing hands, sanitizing cooking utensils and medical instruments, mosquito nets and getting rid of standing water, heating milk before drinking it or making cheese from it, basic stuff like that. But Jesus didn't even know that eating with unwashed hands is bad for you. Knowledge is not the only thing a real God would have that he can give us if he cared about us and existed. God would know the actual cure for every disease right now, every disease, cancer, everything. He could even just cure every disease right now. Now imagine if he were an ordinary person. We weren't talking about God, we were just talking about a Joe. Some guy who knew how to cure every disease on earth and could do it immediately at no expense to himself, yet didn't tell anyone or do anything. Would you think that person cared about us? I wouldn't. Let's take it seriously. Would you think it was reasonable to worship a guy like that, to think anything kind of him? That's not the example of a nice guy, not the sort of example of a guy you'd want to follow or have faith in. The Christian religion is simply not believable in the face of this evidence. Neither Jesus nor Christianity as a whole has exhibited any special source of information about the world, nothing distinctive of actual divine communication. They didn't know about germs, they didn't know about parasites. Christians have no more evidence of having a pipeline to a kind and all-knowing God than any other religion in history has, and that's the principal point here. The fact that it took Christians 1,800 years, do the math on that, 1,800 years, to figure out that germs and parasites even existed, and it might be a good idea to kill them before they kill our kids, proves that Christianity is a man-made religion and not something received from any real God. If you were a time traveler and got back to the first century, what would be one of the first things you told them? Why, about germs and parasites, of course, and how to combat them. It would be absolutely cruel not to withhold that information and watch over half of all children die miserably from preventable diseases for thousands of years. Thus, if Jesus were really God's emissary, he would have told us those things as surely as any compassionate time traveler would, as surely as you would, had you the chance. If you are more informed about the world and more compassionate than Jesus and his God, then the Christian faith is simply not reasonable. It's just another false religion. Now, that's my main negative case, but now let me address some of the points that David Marshall brought up. Now, we're not here to debate whether some belief in God is reasonable or something supernatural exists. Maybe there's a God, maybe there's the supernatural. That's not relevant to this debate. We're here to discuss whether the Christian faith specifically is reasonable. Now, I already refute most of his arguments for a generic God and the generic supernatural in my other works, including The Christian Delusion and The End of Christianity. So if you want to see my whole case against those things, it's there. Here I'll just address what has been argued that is relevant to whether the Christian faith is reasonable. Now, he talks about the Gospels as evidence. The fact is, we don't know who wrote them or who their sources were. And they look just like other tales of gods and demigods, and we don't believe them. Centuries before Christianity, the goddess Inanna and the gods Romulus and Zalmoxis were preached as having died and been resurrected from the dead and communicating with their followers afterwards. Those who believed in Zalmoxis even received eternal life. Sound familiar? We don't believe these stories, so why would we believe the Christian version? You don't trust stories that have men walking on water and calming storms and conjuring food and blotting out the sun and having conversations with demons, so why would you trust this one? It's simply not reasonable to. It's just another mythical superhero story. Now, he didn't mention the epistles. And the epistles give us no evidence of any of these kinds of supernatural things that Jesus was doing. The only Jesus that's known there is in visions and spirit communications that the Christians were having. So we don't have any evidence here of anything special that distinguishes Christianity as more probably true than any other religious faith. Now, I want to give you another example. Is it reasonable to believe an alien spaceship was recovered at Roswell, New Mexico, and alien bodies in it were autopsied by the government? Books written within 40 years of the event in 1947 claim dozens of witnesses saw these things and gave detailed narratives of them. Yet we can look at the original evidence because it still survives and confirm it was just a weather balloon and some test equipment that was actually recovered, no spaceship, no alien autopsies. We don't have access to the original evidence in the case of Jesus. We only have the writings 40 years later of the hardcore believers. This is like having only the books of hardcore believers in the Roswell spaceship and alien autopsies. Yet it is not reasonable to believe them, so it is not reasonable to believe the Gospels. Books written 40 years later by fanatical believers just aren't reasonable evidence. We can't rely on them. We need the original evidence, or evidence we can directly confirm now. But we have no access to that anymore. We therefore cannot reasonably believe in Christianity based on its unverifiable faith literature. We need more reliable evidence than that, just as we would need more reliable evidence to believe in alien autopsies and spaceships. And let's talk about this thing about miracles. He gave several stories about lucky coincidences and people experiencing the supernatural. People of all religious faiths can make those claims. If he could actually present scientific evidence that only Christians had those kinds of experiences, that only Christians experienced supernatural aid, that only Christians experienced lucky coincidences, then he might have a case. But we don't have evidence of that. These things are experienced by everyone, and therefore they show no favor to one religion over another. To give you an example, he talks about an imam who heard a voice to say, "Follow Jesus." Now, if everyone got that voice, if everyone on earth heard a voice to follow Jesus, then you'd have a case. But instead, we're talking about a 1 in a billion example here. If something like that happens so rarely, it looks a lot more like random coincidence, random chance, or something that's not divine. If it happened to everybody, then you'd have a case that maybe there might be something special going on. And he talks about miracle stories. Just read the books of Joe Nickell. Joe Nickell has written many books about this. He actually investigates these miracle stories and finds that, in reality, the evidence doesn't hold up. People's memories are often out of alignment with what actually happened, or the stories aren't true to begin with. So we can't really rely on these kinds of things. And you don't. Let's be honest here. You don't really trust these kinds of things. If I gave you a book that claimed that Gandhi flew through the sky with the devil, battled demons, cured the blind with magical mud, stopped hurricanes with a single command, cast spells that made dinner materialize out of thin air, levitated at will, transmutated substances with a gesture, and survived a month without eating a single morsel, would you believe that book? No, you would not. and you wouldn't make excuses for why you should believe it. You know it's bunk. You don't need to research it. And this would be the case especially when you asked me who wrote the book and I told you I wasn't sure. I don't really know. Even more especially when you asked where the mysterious author of this book learned of these things, and I told you he never really says. It is simply not really reasonable to believe books like this, and there is simply no way to honestly gainsay that fact. You would not trust such a book from any other religion, and yet the book I just described is the New Testament. The Gospels claim Jesus did all these things that I just mentioned there. It even narrates them. You wouldn't believe such a book about Gandhi. Why would you believe such a book about Jesus? Dr. Marshall also talked about the idea of God transcending all cultures. Of course, this is just God, not Christianity, so that actually kind of refutes his case. If Christianity were reasonable, then Christianity, the Christian faith, would transcend all cultures. It does not. Different gods, different religions transcend all cultures. So really, that's evidence against Christianity. If Christianity were true, everyone would have been hearing the gospel from God since the first shaman 40,000 years ago. But that's not the case. Now, I should also point out that the flat earth theory and the geocentric theory also once transcended all cultures. Those also turned out to be false. So transcending all cultures is not a hot recommendation for being evidence of them being true. We also happen to know the psychological mechanisms that lead to belief in God and belief in the supernatural. Read Guthrie's book, Faces in the Clouds, for example. It gives an example. We know a lot about this, how the brain gets tricked into this, and therefore why some of these beliefs transcend all cultures. And I'll also point out that atheism transcends all cultures because we have been communicating, not only have we been communicating our ideas across all cultures, but even independently, atheism has arisen in several cultures. So if atheism transcends all cultures, does that mean atheism is true? I would say it doesn't mean atheism is true. You need more evidence than that. Therefore, transcending cultures is not relevant. He talks about the eloquence and beauty of the Gospels, of Jesus' statements in the Gospels. I find this a typical view of Christians who somehow are very enamored of the Gospels. I read a lot of ancient philosophy from a lot of ancient philosophers, and in fact, I find them much more eloquent and beautiful. I think there are things in Seneca, there are things in Musonius Rufus that are much more brilliant, much more deeply argued, much more beautiful, and much more eloquent for sure. And there are many other Greek and Roman philosophers that are more impressive than the Gospels. And if you want to see examples of this, you can see in my work online. I've written about Musonius Rufus. I've even written about Jesus as a philosopher. You can Google Richard Carey or Jesus philosopher, and you'll probably find those writings. Read the philosophers I talk about and compare them to Jesus, and you'll see that there isn't anything actually special about Jesus. There isn't anything divinely greater, more eloquent, or more beautiful than the things that were being thought of by humans throughout history. How much time do I have left?
3 minutes.
All right. Well, I've rebutted every one of his arguments that's relevant to this debate. So let me see if there's something else I can talk about. Okay, yeah, he mentioned, let's get back to that Gospels and the idea of the miracles in them are somehow believable. They're not. And this is an important point. The Gospels not only claim Jesus walked on water, by the way, they claim Peter did as well. So let's take that as an example here. If you believe that actually happened, I'm sorry, but you're being unreasonably gullible. Unreasonably gullible. Notice that we don't get to see this walking on water, nor did we get to know who told that story of it. And notice how it only ever happened once, conveniently in private. If any Christians, then and since, and even now, could walk on water, like regularly, like this was something that Christians could do as soon as they had enough faith, then Dr. Marshall here might have an argument. But no, Christians can't walk on water or do anything miraculous at all, any more miraculously than any other faith tradition can, pagan or otherwise. When we see stories from religious fanatics about amazing powers no one can ever reproduce, those are the kinds of stories we don't believe. We don't believe floating magical weapons defended the Greek temple of Delphi all by themselves. Yet within 40 years of that, Herodotus claims witnesses said they did. It simply isn't reasonable to believe such claims. That the Gospels contain such dubious tales not only proves they aren't reliable, it proves their authors couldn't tell the difference between a true story and a false one. They just wrote down anything they wanted or whatever they were told. It's not reasonable to believe an author like that when nothing they claim can be reproduced. And I'll end my case there.
Thank you, Dr. Carrier. We're next going to have Dr. Marshall give his 10-minute or so rebuttal.
I was a little surprised to hear that the question of whether God exists is not relevant to the reasonableness of Christianity. I rather thought that it was. Now, one of the things that is interesting about that is the fact that St. Paul and Augustine, thousands of years ago, predicted that awareness of God would be found in countries around the world. David Hume denied that it was found, even in Greece, and certainly not the barbarians who are outside of Greece. So I think that is an extremely relevant point. Miracles, the character of miracles. Richard says there's a lot of silly stories about miracles out there, so why should we believe the silly stories in the Gospels? Now, my contention is that I don't think Richard has actually recognized the true character of the Gospels and the miracle stories in them. I am often amazed reading skeptics and hearing about the parallels, the desire to find parallels to the Gospels, and some of the parallels that I've seen put forward are often quite flabbergasting. And Richard has often talked about books like the Acts of Peter, Acts of John, and Herodotus, some of the marginal stories in Herodotus. Herodotus was an interesting historian, but one of the stories that Richard has also said is a very good parallel to the Gospels is a story of what he calls the story of the resurrection of the fish, mass resurrection of fish, and I call the distant rumor of sizzling fish. There's a story in Herodotus about a group of people during the Persian invasion of Greece who apparently saw some fish flapping on the grill, and Herodotus heard about this, and Richard says that there's no better reason to believe in the resurrection of Jesus than in this rumor. Now, I think that that's probably absurd. One distinction one can make between these two stories, for example, is the fact that Richard Carrier debated William Lane Craig on the subject of the resurrection of Jesus and whether there was good historical evidence for it, and according to Richard, he lost that debate. This is no disgrace to Richard because, in fact, Craig has debated a number of very eminent New Testament scholars who are also skeptics, and according to Luke Muehlhauser, has lost all of those debates. People like Bart Ehrman and Roy Hoover and Marcus Borg, Gerd Ludemann, John Crossan, and Robert Price. Now, if it's so difficult to disprove one single Christian miracle, I think it'd be very difficult to disprove them all. What is the character of the gospel miracles? The gospel miracles, and I looked through all the stories that Richard told in one of his talks to a skeptical organization, Skepticon, and I looked at those miracles, supposed miracles, and then I looked at the miracles of the Gospels, and I found that the gospel miracles tend to evince 5 consistent characteristics. First of all, they tend to be realistic in their background narratives. Secondly, they're purposeful in the sense that they're not just done to show off. Third, they're constructive. They tend not to curse. They tend instead to heal and help. Fourth, they respect the integrity of nature and the integrity of human beings. They don't make people bark like dogs. Fifth, they tend to point people to God. 29 standalone miracles in the book of Luke, 13 standalone miracles in the book of John, and the lowest, from a scale of 1 to 10, by my subjective, admittedly, counting, was realism in the book of John, about 8.6. And all the others were like 9.7, 9.8, around there. So the gospel miracles tend to have these characteristics very strongly, but all of the stories that Richard is conflating with those miracles tend to not have those characteristics at all. So I would not even use the word miracle for both sets of events. I would say that some are miracles, and I prefer to use the word magic for the other ones. Now, the stories that I told about personal experience, they all involve those kind of characteristics also. They're not random, they're not dehumanizing, they're constructive, and they're purposeful, and they're from people that I can trust. Now, or people that seem to be trustworthy. Now, does that mean, okay, well, miracles happen from people of different religions, therefore we can't believe any of them? I don't really see that that's a logical argument. I am a scholar of world religions, and like Richard, I love to read old stuff. I also love to wander into temples and talk to people. And one of the sects that I studied for my master's degree was True Buddha movement, which was just full of miracles, all kinds of magic and things happening, supernatural events supposedly happening. And I asked my supervisor, who was the head of the anthropology department at the University of Washington, if in all his decades as an atheist studying Chinese religions, he'd ever come across an experience in which he was really convinced that something was going on beyond the natural. And he said, maybe once, kind of, sort of. In my decades of researching world religions, maybe I would bump that up a little bit, but as a Christian, I have other resources I can draw on if, for example, we find good evidence of a miracle in another religion. Maybe God did it. I don't have a problem with that. It's up to God. He can do that if he likes. Or maybe there were some other spirits doing things, possibly. If there's good evidence for it, there's good reason to believe it. So what's called the outsider test for faith, kind of trying to use other religions as a crowbar to try to deconstruct Christianity in this regard, I don't think works at all. If there's good evidence for it, maybe it's possibly actually happening. I don't have a problem with that. But I haven't found anything in any other religions, having studied them for many years and having deep respect for many of those religions. I haven't found anything that disconfirms Christianity. Now, the question of the problem of pain. It's a problem. I admit that up front. Why didn't God do this? Why didn't God do that? And then in many regards, I'd have to say, I don't know why he didn't do this or that. That doesn't mean believing in Christianity is unreasonable. There may be disconfirming evidence, no matter what your creed is. There are going to be a few, like the old story, the movie, Doc Hollywood. The doctor crashes his car in a small town, and the mechanics, they put the car together, and he comes back into the garage, and they find a few pieces lying on the ground. He says, oh, don't worry about it. We put the car together again. There's always a few pieces left over. Well, philosophy, worldviews, sometimes a little bit like that, because I don't think anybody has a total understanding of the state of the nature of the universe and what's really going on. So I confess, as a Christian, there are some things I don't understand. The problem of pain, there are some genuine difficulties there. Christian philosophers have shown, I think, that they're not insurmountable difficulties, but they are difficulties in my experience and my feelings, as well as intellectually. I think it's valid to make that argument. However, if there is good reason to believe that the gospel is true, then that remains the case. Now, are there any parallels to the Gospels? Richard Carey is going to give an argument called Why the Gospels Almost Certainly Are Myth. Now, I took the Gospels and analyzed them according to 50 characteristics that define them, and then I compared them to ancient myth and works that contain myth, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, Hercules, the Iliad, the Great Journey to the West in China, according to 8 theological qualities and 42 non-theological qualities. And I found that again and again, myth and the Gospels tended to line up with historical works like Tacitus' Agricola and, most of all, Confucius' Analects. The Gospels, and all those 42 characteristics, or many of them, the Gospels not only lined up with the historical accounts, but they exceeded them in terms of historical value on all of those characteristics. Let me see if I can name a few of them quickly. Dramatic persona don't disappear in the Gospels. They don't keep on reappearing. Jesus overturns hierarchy. his unique, yes, transcendent teachings, as most of the world recognizes, contrary to Richard Carrier's comments. Jesus notices individuals in a way that most people don't in the ancient world. According to Walter Wink, the way his teachings about women, the way he treated women, was unique in the ancient world, without parallel, is the exact words. There's a stylistic contrast between the narrator and Jesus in the Gospels. The radical dialogue, Jesus' radical dialogue with his culture. Time, okay. All right, well, we'll get back to Jesus in a few minutes.
We'll have Dr. Carrier again.
The question of whether God exists is not relevant to this debate for a simple reason. For example, pick any other religion. Let's just say Islam. It doesn't matter. If Islam is reasonable, if the Islamic faith is reasonable, then Christianity is not. The Christian faith is not. The point is, whether God exists or not doesn't tell you whether Christianity has the right beat on him. Maybe some other religion does. Maybe no religion has the correct beat on God. So the existence of God is not relevant. The existence of the supernatural is not relevant. What we want to know is whether the Christian faith itself is reasonable. And that's the only thing we're debating here today. Obviously, we can't debate every conceivable proposition, every single question in one debate. So that's not relevant. I don't need to address those arguments for this debate. He talks about another occasion somewhere where I wrote about the mass resurrection of fish. That's not relevant to this debate either. It's not an argument that I made in this debate. He needs to respond to the arguments that I'm making here in this debate. That's a fallacy called a red herring. He's trying to distract you from the fact that I didn't make that argument in this debate. He also brings up the fact that I claimed I lost the debate to William Lane Craig, and the various other people have lost debates to William Lane Craig, therefore Christianity is reasonable, is kind of the implication he was saying. That's taken out of context, of course. I said I ran out of time. I didn't have enough time to rebut all of William Lane Craig's arguments. So by the measure of whether you get the rebuttals in under the clock or not, I did technically lose that debate. But that has nothing to do with whether William Lane Craig was right or whether Christianity is reasonable. And this is how Craig wins debates generally. He actually gives enough arguments, tons and tons of arguments, using a shotgun effect, so that his rebutter, his opponent, doesn't have enough time to rebut them all before the clock runs out. So the fact that the clock runs out when people are debating William Lane Craig does not make Christianity reasonable. Let me just make that clear. Now, everything he says about the Gospels is true of all kinds of faith literature in all religions. He picks on certain kinds of examples that look different from the Gospels, but that's special pleading. He's picking specific examples through a selection bias to make his argument. There are other examples that look more like the Gospels. For example, the Book of Tobit, or Plutarch's biography of Romulus, or Philostratus' biography of Apollonius of Tyana. There are a lot of these examples of faith literature that look more like the Gospels. And if you wanted me to sit down and research and find the most similar example, I could, but it's not necessary. There's plenty of examples like this that have all the characteristics of the Gospels. Again, if I gave you a book about Gandhi, having all the same attributes that he brings up, all the same attributes he claims the Gospels have, with all those same miracles I was talking about, you still wouldn't believe it, because you can be objective about that and agree that it still wouldn't be reasonable to believe stories like that you can't verify. You can't even verify who wrote those stories, much less what their sources were or that the stories were true. And let's get back to the issue of other religions. If other religions can do miracles, and they can, supposedly, all religious traditions have miracle traditions, then it cannot be argued that Christianity is any more reasonable than those religions. So you can't appeal to the fact that Christians can witness miracles as evidence for Christianity. If only Christians could perform miracles and we could verify that, then you might have a case, but we don't have that kind of evidence. For a Christian faith to be reasonable, we have to look for evidence that meets three criteria at least. A, it has to only be true for Christianity and not other religions. B, we can actually verify that it's true. And C, that indicates knowledge or power beyond what humans of that time already could have had. And we just don't have any evidence like that, and he hasn't presented any. He talks about, for example, Jesus noticing individuals, that's being unusual. I don't see that as being unusual. There's lots of stories in the ancient world. Apollonius of Tyana notices individuals. Pliny the Younger notices individuals. You can pick just about any kind of writing any kind of genre of writing and find examples of people who notice and interact with individuals and have compassion on them. There's an example of from ISIS cult, Apuleius in The Golden Ass, which is often praised by classicists as showing an unusual amount of compassion for the subjects, including slaves and animals, because what happens to the hero is he turns into a donkey, and he goes through all the experiences of a donkey and therefore relates all the suffering and misery and abuse he was taking as a donkey, showing sympathy even for animals. We don't get that from Jesus, of course. He talks about the way Jesus treated women as being unique. That's not even remotely true. If you read the writings of Musonius Rufus again, or Epicurus, they have actually more enlightened and more extensive feminist views about women, at least judging by the standards of the ancient world. So that's not an exceptional case. So the arguments that he made just don't hold up the reasonableness of Christianity, and he didn't give an adequate response to the problem, not only the problem of the fact that diseases are here and Jesus didn't do anything about them, but more importantly, Jesus didn't know about them. And that's really the key issue here. Jesus had no idea about germs. He had no idea about parasites. He didn't do anything. It looks like if you read the Gospels, he assiduously avoided ever encountering anyone with malaria, typhoid, or tuberculosis, much less curing them, much less curing those diseases, much less telling people the very simple pieces of information they could have had to fight those diseases. The basic fact that germs exist, the basic fact that pasteurizing milk is a good idea, the basic ideas of how to combat malaria through combating mosquitoes. Jesus didn't know these things. That means that Jesus was an ordinary human, which means that Christianity is not a reasonable religion. It's based on just what an ordinary guy said or was said about an ordinary guy. So we just don't have a case based on that. And again, if we get to those criteria I was talking about, it's only true for Christianity and not other religions. Did Jesus cure all the diseases on the world? Do Christians now have the ability to consistently cure unusual and difficult, lethal diseases? Do we have faith-healing wings in hospitals, and is it only Christians that can work in those wings? No, these things aren't true. So we don't have any actual evidence that Christianity is any more true than any other religion on the planet, and that's what makes Christianity not a reasonable faith. And I'll revisit the point I made about the time traveler. If you went back in time, you would do these things. You would tell them about germ theory. You would tell them about how to fight malaria. You would tell them about pasteurizing milk. So how could you have more information and be more compassionate than the Christian God or than Jesus? It doesn't make any sense. Unless, of course, Jesus didn't know about those things. Then at least he has an excuse. How much time do I have?
3 minutes.
This doesn't usually happen. I rebut all the arguments before the clock runs out. It's the exact opposite of William Lane Craig. Now, I've basically made all my points, so I'm going to have to sit down. There's nothing more to say.
We'll now have a closing argument from Dr. Marshall.
Now, let me just suggest that being dead is a verifiable disease and that it is not psychosomatic to raise somebody from the dead. Also, science, according to Carrier himself, was invented largely by theists in the ancient world, and then by Christians, not Carrier, but this is actually a fact, by Christians in the modern world. What would God do? How should God do it? Reading Richard Carrier's idea of what God ought to have done instead of, actually some of his ideas do not really appeal to me. I don't think the world that Richard Carrier would have created, with all due respect, would very much interest me. I'd probably try to kill myself, but then the gun would turn into a flower instead or something like that. Richard talked about Apollonius of Tyana. If you missed the old Saturday Night Live, I urge you to go out and get a copy of Apollonius of Tyana and compare it to the Gospels. It's actually one of the texts that I talk about in Why the Jesus Seminar Can't Find Jesus. There's practically nothing similar to the Gospels in Apollonius of Tyana, even though it was written 150 years after the Gospels. Some people think it was written in order to undermine the Gospels in some way. But read them and compare, by all means. Richard talks in one of his books, a little bit autobiographically. He writes about how reading the Gospels, he found them confused, illogical, and irrelevant for the modern context. And then he discovered Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese philosopher, and fell in love with the profound wisdom of Lao Tzu. And I agree with him on that point. I really enjoy Lao Tzu. I've read it in the original classical Chinese. I've memorized parts of it. But compare that perception of the Bible to a fellow by the name of Lin Yutang, who was one of the great Chinese scholars of the 20th century. Lin Yutang lost his faith. He was born in a Christian family and fell in love with Chinese culture and wrote some of the most wonderful writings. He almost won the Nobel Prize for his historical novels, and he wrote a dictionary of English. He wrote an anthology of Indian and Chinese writings. And then he also wrote at the end of his life an autobiography that was called From Pagan to Christian. And then in that book, he described again his love of Confucius, respect for Confucius, his love for Lao Tzu, and his favorite Zhuangzi, the comic philosopher. And at the end of this book, he talked a little bit about materialism and why he thought he didn't care much for materialism, because we Chinese pagans always believe in God, which I think supports Christianity still. I do believe that. But at the end of the book, he said, "Blow out the candles, the sun has risen." And he was talking about Jesus Christ. Through his deep, wide knowledge of the gospel, of human traditions, of Western, Indian, and Chinese traditions. In other words, not that he disparaged them, but by the comparison to the Gospels and to Jesus, the figure of Jesus, which has so enraptured the human race for the last 2,000 years. Even non-Christians like Tolstoy and Jefferson. Blow out the candles, the sun has risen. There is enough light for those who desire only to cease, and enough darkness for those of contrary disposition, to quote Pascal. Jesus was prophesied by the ancients, I would claim not just in Hebrew culture. I believe he lends new meaning to the great ancient traditions of Asia. I think he has transformed the trajectory of history. This is not all done in a corner, but it is a central transforming event in human history, the interpretive key, the eureka that allows us to suddenly make sense of human, even cosmic history. Still, one can find areas of murkiness as well. The issue before us, though, tonight is not whether one can be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. That will have to wait for another night. The question is the Christian faith reasonable? Are there good reasons to believe? And I think that we have seen that there are. We've only had time to talk briefly this evening and argue a few points. G.K. Chesterton said, "The object of opening the mind, as of opening the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid." And that's what I invite you to be. Open-minded in the fullest sense, by which I mean open to finding and holding to truth. Our moment in the hallway of life is brief, in the old medieval image of a bird passing through a great hall. Beyond that hallway, many of us believe, lies a greater realm. We have seen tonight, I think, that this is a reasonable belief. It seems that there is a God who transcends particular cultures. That is part of the Christian creed. He does act in the world sometimes. That is also part of the Christian creed. And it is reasonable to recognize Jesus as what he said he was. I am the door, and invites us to enter a fuller life through him. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have Dr. Carrier give his closing.
Dr. Marshall led with death is not a psychosomatic disease. Yeah, actually it is. Misdiagnosed deaths occur often. I've documented this extensively in some of my writings before, and it's well known, actually. In fact, it was so common the ancients often have stories about it. So it is possible for someone to think that they're dead and they're not really dead. It's possible for someone to seem almost entirely dead and yet not be dead and be revived later. So that is also the case. Now, there are also occasions, by the way, of faked resurrections, but I don't think that's relevant to the particular argument we're engaged in here today. The only evidence that Jesus was resurrected of the Gospels and some comments in the epistles of Paul I've already made my case. The Gospels just aren't trustworthy. They're no more trustworthy than the biography of the resurrection of Romulus, or the story of the resurrection of Zalmoxis, or the story of the resurrection of Inanna, or any of these other gods. Whether they're resurrected gods or not doesn't matter. We don't believe stories like this. It's not reasonable to, because we don't know who wrote them. We don't know what their sources are. We can't verify any information in them. And in the epistles of Paul, all he says are that people had visions. That's the only thing that convinced them. That's the only thing that Paul mentions as convincing them, are the visions of a risen Jesus. I put it to you that visions of a dead person can be psychosomatic, obviously. And we have many examples in pagan religion and other religions of visions of the resurrected dead. So, and he talks about that the biography of Apollonius of Tyana is different from the Gospels. I don't see anything about it that is different, relevant to this debate, that any particular example, specific examples of criteria that he mentioned about the Gospels apply equally well to the biography of Apollonius of Tyana, but you can find that yourself. You can read it. Now, obviously, they're different pieces of literature. They're written in different style. They're written by different authors. They have different aims, but they have a lot of similarities. So do the stories of Romulus, for example, and other heroes of the time, and in other religions and other eras as well. The bottom line is that Christianity is only reasonable if Christianity is true. But if Christianity were true, Jesus and the basic core gospel would have been taught worldwide since the first shaman, like I said. It had been taught 40,000 years ago. It had been taught in all cultures, in all eras. It would be what everyone who engages in introspection and seeks God, it would be when everyone who does that would get the same voice. They would get Jesus telling them the same information about the basic gospel. We don't get that. We get complete diversity over time and over space as well. We don't get consistency. So Christianity is not reasonable. If Christianity were reasonable, if it were true, we would have this consistent message. And one important point is, I find it rather strange, and I'm not quite sure what he meant by it, but he seemed to imply that a world without disease is not a better world than this one, which makes me wonder why on earth we bother trying to fight it. A world without kids dying by horrible diseases by the millions is not a better world. He even said that he'd rather shoot himself than live in that world. I don't understand that. I put it to you that that's not a reasonable faith to have. Obviously, we need to work for a better world. Obviously, we need to reduce, even if possible, eliminate all diseases. And diseases aren't the only one. I could have gone on about a dozen other things besides diseases. That was just the one example I picked on to work with in this debate to save time. Obviously, there can be a better world. That's why we work towards it. That's why the world is better today than it was 2,000 years ago. And it can be better. We all know that we can make the world a better place. We all know there's things that are screwed up about this world that we could fix, if only we had the resources or the means to do it. God has unlimited resources and unlimited means, and he can talk to anyone. He can convince them. He can explain to them why they're wrong. If they're crazy and therefore can't reason coherently, he can fix it and say, cure their insanity so they can reason coherently. God can do all kinds of things. And if we could do those things, we would do them. If we could cure mad people, if we could cure an insane man, if an insane man is going to go and kill a bunch of kids and shoot them, and we could telepathically go into his head and fix his insanity and talk him down, obviously we'd do that. Well, who would not do that if we had the power to do it? It doesn't make any sense. If we could turn the bullets in his gun into popcorn, therefore so that he couldn't shoot anybody, yeah, we would do that. And it would be a better world if that happened. What we would expect if there were any kind of kind governance of this world is that we would find the world, the entire world, consistently engaged in moral governance. The world would be morally governed. There would be equitable justice. The world would work justly. We would see active intervention, keeping things just and fair and kind and happy. We don't see that. So I don't find Christianity reasonable. Now I'm going to end. I have time? Okay. Well, if you want to learn more about that stuff, I have lots of books that tell you more about my beliefs, why I believe what I believe, and it goes way beyond this debate. Take a look at them. Thanks.
I'd like to thank the speakers for their contributions. If you would, we will take a 5-minute recess. People on the web, you may take a 5-minute recess as well. and we will reconvene here for question and answers in 5 minutes. Thank you.
But, logistics.
I have 2 requests to make of you when asking questions, maybe 3. One is, perhaps, if there's a particular person you're directing your question toward, you can say who it is. This is Dr. Marshall, Dr. Carrier. They're both going to stand over here. Secondly, I know that many people like to say thank you for the talk and to comment on the talk. Perhaps, since there are so many people lined up, you might save that for afterwards. I am sure they would like more to hear it in person from you than from standing at the microphone. With that said, we'll take the gentleman over here first.
Hello. Just 2 words, really. Leprosy and heaven. You seem to be in denial, Carrier seemed to be in denial that Jesus at least supposedly healed leprosy, and maybe you'd like to elaborate about that. And you seem to be in denial that you're aiming for heaven. Like if you don't want diseases healed or else you'd put a gun to your head, then what do you want to go to heaven for, since you seem to don't be interested in like the whole lion laying down with the lamb kind of thing. So those are my 2 questions.
Thank you. Is that for me? I think one was for Dr. Carrier.
Yeah, it was leprosy and heaven.
Yeah, no, the Gospels, the word for leprosy, we don't know what it actually means. We don't know that it actually corresponds to what we now call leprosy. So we actually have no idea what kind of disease he was actually curing, or if he was actually curing an actual disease, because sometimes leprosy was something of, it's kind of like the untouchables in India, like as a caste. Some people would thought to be cursed, so that you would touch them, it would be bad. So we don't really know if it was an actual disease, if it was skin lesions or whatever, because it's not described, and the word is too ambiguous. So we have no idea what that was.
Yeah, my actual point was that Richard's idea of how God would work, how God ought to work, is not, I think, the criteria for understanding what Christianity is predicting. For example, the gospel predicts, Jesus predicts, that the church of the kingdom of God will grow like a seed into a tree, and the birds of the air will flock to that tree, which implies slow growth over many years from a single point. And I think that's what the gospel actually predicts, as opposed to Richard Carrier's presumption about what God ought to be predicting. That was the distinction I was trying to make. I'm not at all suicidal. I'm not planning to shoot myself. Just to clarify that.
Just to clarify my view, what I'm saying is that God should act like a decent person. That's it.
Thank you. This gentleman, please.
Yes. Can y'all speak to the Old Testament and how it points toward the accuracy of the New Testament? Because Dr. Carey, you're talking about the New Testament, and you don't really have good evidence historically of its accuracy. You can't trace its roots, I assume is what you're saying. But the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to give us good indication that at least Isaiah, which has numerous prophecies pointing toward Christ that are corroborated in the New Testament, that through carbon dating was verified was hundreds of years before Christ. Explain some mathematics there to the audience, because we both, people who believe in God, people who don't, pretty much believe that mathematics is pure.
Yeah,
and there's some evidence there in the Old Testament that point to
I
the
don't
New
know
Testament.
what specific example you have in mind, but I'll give one, because I have an idea. You mentioned Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's an example in that. For the longest time, Christians, if we know from ancient Christian literature, the Christians were claiming that Isaiah had a passage about the suffering servant who dies to atone for the sins of Israel that mentions him being pierced. Isaiah 53. Yeah, it mentions the guy being the servant who dies being pierced, and then a lot of modern scholars thought that no, that was a Christian fabrication. The Dead Sea Scrolls actually have that word in there, so we've actually confirmed that was an attested reading in Jewish literature before Christianity arose. Now, in basic terms of how prophecy works, I call that causation. I think that there were already Jews talking about a crucified, or someone who would be crucified in the future, that this would be the Messiah, and that this actually generated Christian belief later on. And in fact, my next book, which will come out towards the end of this year, on the historicity of Jesus Christ, will make an extensive, well-documented case for this. And I'm not the only one who's done it. There have been many scholars who've argued this, that there already were pre-Christian Jewish ideas of an expectation of a dying Messiah. And the Isaiah passage would even, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, would even suggest that they were anticipating that he would be crucified, and that this would therefore generate Christian belief. And it's not like Christian. I mean, if you have an example of you say something is going to happen, someone reads that and then goes and makes it happen, that's not fulfilled prophecy. That's humans actually making it happen.
Yeah, I don't really think that Jesus made the crucifixion happen, and I think there's a lot of details in the crucifixion and in the resurrection story that could not possibly have been arranged by Jesus or by the apostles either. And I think that there are some wonderful passages in the Old Testament that do point directly to Jesus, and they attempt to slow them off and say, well, they were just invented later. I think it's very unlikely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
All right, this is for Dr. Marshall. In the case of the Salem witch trials, we have a multitude of accounts, first-hand accounts, and sometimes original source material of eyewitnesses to witchcraft, and oftentimes people confessing to witchcraft. So if the Gospels are the primary reason that we accept Jesus and what he did, and what we have basically are just supposed eyewitness accounts, do you accept that there were also witchcraft going on in the Salem witch trials? And if not, by what standard do you accept one and not the other?
Yeah, I think I explained that already. Those aren't miracles in the Christian sense. Secondly, if you look at them historically, and I have looked a little bit into the Salem witch trials, I don't really think you have the same sort of situation. Read the accounts of the Salem witch trials and read the Gospels. No, I don't see that the parallel is all that close. And the kind of event that is called witchcraft, people flying through the air and changing into beasts, is really not the same kind of event that is the central normative kind of miracles going on in the New Testament. You might find a few that look a little odd, but the central normative stories of the Gospels show Jesus doing a very different kind of act than anything you find in the Salem witch trials.
I'll just say that one of the books I'm selling today and that you can get online and in Kindle is The End of Christianity, and it has a chapter on it in it by a philosopher who actually makes a specific comparison between the Salem trials and the Gospels, and extensively talks about the documentation we have for the Salem witch trials, which is far better than we have for the miracles of Jesus. So if you want to really see how that plays out with an actual comparison of the texts and so forth, that's a chapter to read because it covers what you're talking about.
Thank you. Please.
This is the same question, but I guess addressed to both. Dr. Marshall, you said that in someone of Tyana, that some...
Apollonius of Tyana.
Yes. That those two, that account is incredibly different from that of the Gospel. And Dr. Carrier said it was incredibly similar. Could both of you explain why you took your respective sides?
Yeah, I don't say it's incredibly similar. I specifically noted there are many differences, but the point is that the differences aren't relevant to the debate. What we're looking for are particular criteria that supposedly make the miracles of Jesus more believable than the miracles of Apollonius, or that make the teachings of Jesus more divinely supernatural than the teachings of Apollonius. When you look at those criteria and then compare the two, one doesn't actually come out better than the other, and that's what I was saying. And you can do that by just go and read it. You can read Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories in Apollonius of Tyana is about the monkeys in India that harvest peppers. They farm peppers, and the 25-meter crested dragons, the different species that live in India. I would also urge you to read Apollonius of Tyana and get a good, but specifically, in my analysis of 50 characteristics of the Gospels, I found that Apollonius of Tyana, as I recall, something like 10 or 11 of those characteristics. Now, many of them actually are historicity-bearing characteristics that I talked about a little bit earlier on tonight. So, yes, absolutely, there's a wealth of historicity, of confirming evidence within the Gospels that you will never find anywhere in Apollonius of Tyana, especially for those kinds of events. Apollonius was a real person, though. I mean, he existed, but stories of him very late and very mixed up.
Thank you. Please.
My question is for Dr. Mitchell. Is there anything you would accept as disproof for the divinity of Jesus?
Was this a question for Dr. Marshall?
I'm sorry, I called you the wrong name, Dr. Marshall. I'm sorry. Is there anything you would accept for the as disproof of the divinity of Jesus?
Anything you would accept?
Well, if you found Jesus' bones, that would certainly go a long ways.
Ironically, I don't agree. I think even if we did find Jesus' bones, Christianity could still be true. And in fact, I talk about this in a debate I had with William Lane Craig on PAX Television years ago. You might be able to find it online somewhere, where me and Dr. Craig are on TV on Lee Strobel's television show, and I make out the case where I explain it, because I've defended the theory that, and there's extensive evidence for this, that the original Christians didn't think Jesus rose in the body of flesh, that he cast it aside like a shell and then rose from the dead in a new body, a new, more glorious, more powerful body. So that would leave the bones behind, and his resurrection would really have happened. So it's actually theoretically possible for the bones to exist and still for Christianity to be true. However, on the other side of that, we don't have the bones of hardly anyone from the ancient world, so the fact that we can't find his doesn't make Christianity reasonable either. So it's a wash as far as evidence goes.
Thank you. Please.
Dr. Carrier, getting back to the narrow thesis of the debate, do you have a cleaning lady that cleans your office by any chance? I had a cleaning lady in my office, and she had a lot of troubles in her life. And she got a lot of hope from reading her Bible, and she couldn't have persisted very well without that, I don't think. We give placebos to people. We know they don't scientifically, exactly work. They work because they have this power in them, a belief. And so maybe, narrowly speaking, Christianity is sort of reasonable to believe by some people. Maybe for some of us it's not reasonable, but there's a reason perhaps for it. Would you agree with something like that?
No, for two reasons. The first is that it's simply not true that Christianity is the only way to give someone that placebo. There are tons of religions and secular philosophies that can also give someone hope or give them strength and power in adversity. So it's simply not the case that Christianity is the only one that can do that, and therefore that doesn't make Christianity any more reasonable than any other faith or any other non-faith.
Was the word only in the thesis of the debate?
Well, that's getting to my second point. The only way you can placebo someone that way is if you have them adopt a faith-based epistemology, an epistemology that makes it possible for them to believe false things just because they're useful. Now, if someone has that epistemology, they're going to believe a lot more false things because they think they're useful than just the one that you think will help them, including a lot of bad beliefs. And that's where we have a lot of trouble today because of that. For example, opposition to gay marriage, abuse of the rights of gays, for example, is the result of bad beliefs that get snuck in along the coattails of another placebo, which might be Christianity that gives hope, and so on. So if you're going to have that kind of epistemology, it's bad because you're going to be susceptible to false beliefs, and essentially these infections of false beliefs. The only way to secure yourself and protect yourself from false beliefs that can lead you to do and say bad things is to have a non-faith-based epistemology, an epistemology that makes it very, very difficult for you to believe in false things. Now, the result of this is that you can't believe in false things that are useful, so you'd better find true beliefs that are useful instead, and it's much better if you do that.
Hear, hear for true beliefs. The term faith-based reasoning is a little bit misleading, though, I think, because Christians have based their faith on reasoning for 2,000 years, as we show in the book True Reason. And we'll be adding an appendix in the print version pretty soon. We'll show that in more explicit detail. One thing I would piggyback on this question, which I think is relevant, is one way in which it's relevant is God promised Abraham that through his seed he would bless all the nations of the earth. And Christians interpret that as referring to Jesus Christ. Now, I would argue and have argued that, in fact, the gospel has blessed the world more than anything else over the last 2,000 years. That's a topic for another debate or for another evening, but I think that is relevant to that question, and it is one way in which the impact of a belief is intellectually relevant to the reasonableness of that belief. Only one way.
It's funny, I actually expected him to use that argument in the debate, so I had to leave a whole page of my response out. Let's just do the short list.
Just very briefly, please.
The pagans gave us democracy, citizenship, human rights, in fact, the entire concept of rights, including freedom of speech, science, medicine, philosophy, formal logic, and mathematics. They also gave us a philosophical defense of moral virtues, including philanthropy, generosity, mercy, and honesty. Does that make paganism reasonable? No. The reason pagans came up with these things is not because they were pagans, it's because they just happened to be pagans at the time that these humans came up with these brilliant and beautiful and good ideas and disseminated them. The fact that Christians may have done and come up with good things and good ideas and done good things is not because they're Christians, it's because they just happened to be Christians at the time. If they were Muslims or if they were pagans at the time, they might have come up with the same ideas and done the same things, just as pagans did lots of great things that we also benefit from tremendously. So,
Do you want a short reply?
That will be another debate, definitely.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, thank you. After that, I don't want to waste my question, but the moral law comes from God. So, but I would like to, this for Dr. Marshall. I teach 2 classes on C.S. Lewis here in Huntsville at a local high school. And I was, with the problem of pain and C.S. Lewis, I think there's 3 F's that you could maybe address and help the audience with, maybe the fall, free will, and faith. That may help clarify some of the... that I think would help make your case.
Yeah. The fall, free will, and faith. I don't think I want to make those arguments tonight, and I think I would rather leave those for professional philosophers to work on, because I have some disagreements with some fellow Christians on those subjects. So I think I'll leave that one alone, with all due respect.
and I want to make the point that I think that's totally appropriate for him to do, because that would be, he would have to, it would be unfair of him to make him try to answer that question in the short time that we have here. So, that's completely appropriate.
Please, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate both of you being here. This isn't the first debate I've ever got to come to, and I've really enjoyed it. But what I wanted to say, and then lead to a question, or just something for you to address, is I was surprised that on both sides, in addressing the reasonableness of the Christian faith, is that the heart of man didn't come into it. And, just dealing with, and we talked about so many old books and historical things and old writings. And yes, we weren't there right then to know exactly what it was like, or were these a fable, or were they true. And so we disprove things based on that. But we have so many modern day testimonies and documented things and writings and what's happening right in the world among us right now, where the hearts of men are changed, and sometimes it's pretty radical. And I know there's a lot of people who claim the name of Christ and do wrong things, bad things, but in some cases it's called a rebirth or a born again experience, because you start out as a baby, and babies make a lot of mistakes.
Could you pose your question?
Yes, I'm sorry. Okay. I'm leading to it. I just wanted to say, can you deal with the modern day reasonableness of it? Everything was so based on old things, but modern day, yes, the hearts of men are changed and for good, and they are doing things for the world. Okay.
Thanks.
I'll take it, then you can follow me. So if I understand correctly, this sounds like an issue I addressed in my book, Sense and Goodness Without God. I have a chapter on comparing different religions. And in reality, this kind of changed life, this sort of rebirth experience, is very common. Also in The Christian Delusion, Valerie Tarico is a psychologist who talks about this experience. Many different faith traditions and atheists have had these same kinds of...
Yes, changed experience, or say I have a new
heart.
experience.
That's right.
But some, like in religions where women are sacrificed when their husbands die in the Hindu religion, I'm saying that leads towards good things and changing the
Ma'am.
world in a positive
Yeah,
way.
so I mean, the question is what I assume is that if you have this experience, does that make continuing to believe what the experience is tied to reasonable? I've had that changed experience when I became a Taoist. I had this really epiphany that changed me as a person and made me a better person, I think. But I since realized that the religion was false, but all the things that made me better remained true, even though Taoism itself is false. And I think that's the reality of many atheists. You talk to anyone who had that kind of experience and then later became an unbeliever, they'll tell you the same thing, that they have retained all of the lessons they learned from that experience, even though they realize that the religion that experience was at the time tied to was false. So I don't think just having those kinds of experiences means that it's unreasonable, or means that it's reasonable to believe the religion, precisely because lots of different religions cause those experiences, and even non-religions cause those experiences. So you know it's not the religion that's doing it, it's something else in the nature of man that's doing it. And I think it comes down to the same kind of eureka moment that scientists have, and engineers have, and writers have, and so on, in other domains. And if you have that same experience in the moral domain, or in the domain of your meaning of your life and so forth, you're going to have that same experience. And if at the time you have that experience, you associate it with some religion that just happens to be in your life, you will mistake the experience as being caused by the faith principles of that religion, when in reality it's being caused by your brain coming to a realization.
Oh.
First of all, about the old stuff, if you find fingerprints on a window pane, the fingerprints might have been placed there a long time ago, but you can tell from the characteristics of the fingerprints that a person has been here and who that person was. And you can tell from the characteristics of the Gospels that a person has been here and a lot about who that person was, and I think that's powerful evidence for who Jesus is and the reasonableness of Christianity. Secondly, as far as conversion experiences go, yes, people do have remarkable experiences of conversion in various different religions, some for the better, some for the worse. Malcolm X is a great example. But I would argue that the gospel has been the center course of human reform, not coincidentally, but because of the teachings and example of Jesus down through the thousands of years, and because of the work of the Holy Spirit in human lives. But that would take a very long debate to develop that point.
Thank you. Please.
My question is for Dr. Richard Carrier, and I noticed there is an argument used a lot in the gospel evidence and how like the gospel writers don't tell us their sources. And I'm a history student here, and I've read some of like Josephus and Tacitus and the ancient historians, and since you're an ancient historian, I know you have too. And one thing I noticed when I read them, and many scholars think they're reasonably accurate, not infallible, of course. But one thing I notice when I read them is that they do occasionally tell us what their source was for some specific thing, unlike the Gospels, but it's still very rare. They're still more tied into the narrative, a lot like the Gospel. So I just want to know, like, your thoughts on that, and do you agree that, like, Greco-Roman history writers did that a lot?
Yeah, it varies. The way they use sources and the way they cited them, and also the kinds of claims they use or made and so on, and the way they analyze them. I give an example in Chapter 7 of Not the Impossible Faith, comparing Suetonius, who we consider one of our unreliable historians, not most unreliable, but on that end of the spectrum, comparing him to the book of Acts, for example, or the Gospels even. And even Suetonius comes out better. The reality is that we don't trust a lot of what the ancient historians write, including Tacitus and Josephus. We're pretty sure they're making some stuff up or getting some things wrong, but not everything. And some things we can corroborate independently. So it's a case-by-case basis. There's a book by an author named Grant. I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like Greek and Roman Historians, Information and Misinformation, which tells the story of why we really don't and shouldn't trust ancient historians too much. We don't throw them out completely like the baby with the bathwater. And in another debate, I made the point that there's a certain amount of things I would trust in Tacitus, but if Tacitus were a manual for building a rocket ship, I would not get on that rocket.
anything. What was I? I was thinking of something there. I forgot what it was. Yeah. What was the question?
It was about the.
Sorry, I did 4 hours of lecturing this morning. Oh, yes. Okay. And then I remember the point I was going to make. Yeah. A really good source, a really good book on, a couple of good books on the book of Acts as a historian are by Ben Witherington. And I think he rehabilitates Acts in a spectacular way and shows that he's a very reliable historian. But again, I'm arguing not just from ordinary history and saying Luke is a good historian. I'm also saying that there is what you could call forensic evidence in the Gospels that points to the reliability of those texts.
Thank you.
Okay, after you've read Witherington, read Richard Purvow's commentary on Acts, or if you want something much shorter that's not nearly as detailed as either of those books, Richard Purvow's book, it's called The Mystery of Acts. It's a little tiny book. By the end of it, you will throw Acts in the trashes when it comes to reliable historians.
Thank you. Please.
Thanks. Hi, yes, thank you guys. Appreciate y'all coming out. This is for Dr. Carrier, and there at the end of your talk there, I think that I got down that you had mentioned that Christianity would be reasonable. Number one, if it's true, so if it's not true, it's not reasonable. And secondly, if it had been taught from the very beginning everywhere. Now, I myself am not an atheist, although I wouldn't go so far as to say, so I don't believe atheism is true. However, I believe that there are probably good atheists here that are reasonable people, and that atheism itself is a coherent or reasonable worldview without necessarily being true or taught everywhere. So my question is, given your own criteria for the reasonableness of Christianity, would atheism, according to that criteria, be true?
Yeah, I gave 3 criteria.
Yeah, that was earlier, and I agree with those 3 criteria. They were good, but at the end there.
Those 3 criteria, those are the ones. So apply those. When you do, I mean, atheists aren't making any supernatural claims, so they don't have to prove supernatural powers behind them. So all we need to do is find that the evidence backs us. If you want, and we didn't debate whether atheism was reasonable or whether God, for example, I made the point that whether God exists is not relevant to this debate. But if you are interested in whether atheism is reasonable and my case for it and the reasoning I have for it, the End of Christianity has some of the best chapters on that and compares, there's one chapter on Christianity and one on the design argument. I think you should read both of those and you'll see pretty well why I am where I am in this debate. So.
I appreciate this. Quick follow-up, if that's okay.
If you would let Dr. Marshall.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you wanted to say.
Yeah. One of Richard's, I don't know if you call him a mentor, but teachers on Bayes' theorem originally, early on he was reading Tim McGrew, who was professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. And I recently asked him what he would think. I'm not going to say anything disparaging here, but I asked him what he thought about the possibility of using Bayes' theorem, which I know nothing about, I'll admit, to investigate the idea of miracles and whether atheism is reasonable. In order for atheism to be true, basically all of the miracles, all of the supernatural signs that have happened, all the wonderful answers to prayers that people have experienced, including intelligent, educated people, would all have to be delusional, mistaken, frauds, lies, and whatnot. What are the odds of that? I don't think they're very high. Now, there are some aspects of atheism that I think are kind of intellectually fetching, but I don't think it's at all likely that atheism could be true just because of that.
And that's incorrect in terms of probability theory. If you have, for example, we don't really know, for example, whether the supernatural exists. So you can't argue that because it would require natural explanations for everything, that therefore the supernatural has to be probable. That's not sound reasoning. All we can do is look at specific cases. You would look at one case and then do a calculation, do another case, do a calculation, and so on. At the end of that run of Bayesian equations, you would not end up with a high probability of the supernatural. You would end up with a low probability of the supernatural. But I'm not going to explain, because we didn't go into Bayes' theorem here, so I'm not going to explain how that would happen. But if you want some of the background for the logic of this, it is in my book, Proving History. Proving History is designed for historians and humanities majors, so it's designed for people who are afraid of math. So if you want to learn Bayes' theorem and you're a humanities major or a historian or whatever, or if you're not, but you want to see how Bayes' theorem can be applied to historical questions, including miracles, and I give specific examples of miracles that I analyze in there with Bayes' theorem, that book explains it to you, explains how the theorem works and how you would go about even proving that miracles existed if they did. So that's the book to look at for that.
We have 1 minute left in our Q&A, so maybe we will go a couple minutes over, but this will be the last question.
Good evening, gentlemen. A question for each of you. Dr. Carrier, what are the implications for your philosophical outlook in respect to the Shroud of Turin and the Veronica cloth? And Dr. Marshall, what are the implications for your belief as it relates to the divinity of Christ, where clearly he was wrong in several statements of his beliefs or what he saw, namely that he did not come back in the time that he indicated in the Gospels. And two, we seem to have evolved, which would put at variance the Genesis account of Adam and Eve.
For the Shroud of Turin, that would be a whole other debate. The book to read, Joe Nickel wrote a book on it. I'd start with that if you want to know why I don't think that there's anything miraculous about the Shroud of Turin. We actually have records of a confessed forger of it. The carbon dating matches the date of that forger. And all of the attempts to rehabilitate it as somehow supernatural are based on bad science. So it's a classic kind of UFOs and aliens kind of scenario. But like I said, to try and defend that here would take a while. So look at Joe Nickel's book from there, and then you can Google further beyond that. But Joe Nickel's book was the first one to read.
Let's see. Evolution was one thing, and the return of Jesus was the other question.
That's correct, sir.
Yeah. On the return of Jesus, I admit there's some passages that look like Jesus is prophesying that he's going to return sooner than he actually has so far. I think that most of the things Jesus did prophesy, however, have come true and came true in his life and later on. So, I'm willing to cut the records a little bit of slack and how those records are interpreted. Apparently, Jesus didn't mean right away. As far as evolution goes, there's a lot of different perspectives on that different Christians have. My own perspective is I think there is some evidence in biology and in physics for God and for creation. I'm not a young earth creationist. I think that God, like the tree planted in the ground that grew up over many years, in this case many millions of years, I think that God created slowly. And exactly how he did that is a subject for a very long debate involving people much more qualified than anybody probably on this stage tonight. But I think it's a fascinating question and a fascinating discussion when it occurs.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Please.
We were going to end the debate.
If you don't mind.
I do mind. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can you ask after? Last. Okay.
He'll be at a table afterwards.
Richard,
you can ask him.
Are you okay?
I want to make a statement and I want to ask a question. First of all, do you all remember the first of the 10 Commandments?
May you ask the question?
I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have false gods before me. Never did he give the authority and say, I am the Lord thy God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Prophet Jesus is not divine. Like Christmas and Sunday, Emperor Constantine, in order to paganize the Christian people, said, you can believe in the sun, which was the sun. This is why the winter solstice is in...
Ma'am, could you ask a question, please?
Okay. In the fact that you know that paganism is intertwined in Christianity, how can you continue to not question the divinity of Prophet Jesus? We, as Muslims, also believe that he will be coming back. But it is a major sin on the Day of Judgment to associate God with a partner. Never did Prophet Jesus say, worship me. And how do you attribute paganism being intertwined And why is it Christians are not fighting against that? The Unitarian Christians understand, but why is it they're allowing the worship of a human being to permeate? Satan has gotten to everybody in the way of convincing us that Prophet Jesus was God and the Son of God. God does not beget. Only humans and animals beget.
Thank you. May we give the speaker?
Well, God actually says that we
Ma'am.
diminish his greatness by attributing
I'm very
him.
sorry. I did
Well,
not
how
mean to
is
be
it
rude.
you can...
Yes.
Okay,
Please.
thank you for the question. I did 4 hours of lecture this morning on Christianity and world religions, and we did talk a little bit about Islam. I wish very much this lady had come to those lectures, and we could have had a wonderful discussion, I think. The Christian doctrine of the Trinity, I don't think I have time to defend it tonight as much as I would like to. But I will say this word. Jesus said, and boy, this gets me in hot water again. Jesus said, don't think I've come to do away with the law and the prophets. I've come to fulfill the law and the prophets. And I believe Jesus is the fulfillment of the deepest desires of human beings around the world, including those one might call pagans. And the person I quoted earlier on, Lin Yutang, was an excellent example of that. I don't have time to explain what it was, but he said that we Chinese pagans have always believed in God. Now, that's a little bit of an overgeneralization, but I think the relationship between paganism and Christianity is not quite as negative. There are some negative characteristics. The gospel does repudiate harmful behavior and all kinds of things, but it's not entirely a negative relationship, in my opinion. But I'd love to talk about that more, but I think that's probably enough.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I would like to thank again Ratio Christi, UAH Non-Theists, University of Alabama in Huntsville, and the Student Government Association. And if you would please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers.